The drill bit screamed against rock that should not have existed at that depth. Dr. Elena Voss stood in the control trailer at the edge of the excavation site, watching the red line on her screen spike and then flatten out completely. For 3 weeks, the survey team had been boring through the dry crust of the Gobi Desert, chasing a strange magnetic anomaly that the satellites had first flagged 18 months earlier. The readings did not match any known mineral deposit. They did not match anything in the geological record at all. And now, at 2,300 meters, the drill had simply stopped, as if it had struck something that refused to be cut. "Report," she said, not taking her eyes off the monitor. "Bits intact," said Marcus, the site engineer, leaning over her shoulder. "No damage." It just stopped, like hitting a wall of glass that won't crack. Elena rubbed her eyes. She had not slept properly in 4 days. The dig was funded by a joint UN geological survey, officially searching for rare earth deposits that the anomaly's magnetic signature seemed to promise. Unofficially, half the funding had come through channels she was not supposed to ask about, routed through a general named Okafor, who visited the site twice and asked more questions about structural integrity than about ore samples. "Get me a core sample," she said. "I want to know what that wall is made of." It took 6 more hours, and a diamond-tipped bit that cost more than her yearly salary, before they finally cracked through. What came back up was not stone. It was a thin, dark gray plate, smooth as glass on one side, and warm to the touch, even after being pulled from a place that had never seen sunlight. Elena held the fragment in her gloved hand under the trailer's harsh light, and felt something she could not explain. It was not fear, not yet. It was recognition, the way a person feels when they see a shape they cannot name but somehow already know. "Metal that isn't metal," Marcus muttered, running a scanner over it. "No, wait. It is metal. The scanner just doesn't like the numbers it's giving back." "What numbers?" "Density readings that don't make sense for anything on the periodic table." "Elena, I don't think this is ours. I don't think this is anyone's." She should have called it in immediately. Instead, she held the plate a moment longer, turning it in the light, and noticed something along one edge. A groove. Deliberate. Machine precise. Running in a pattern that looked almost like a seam. Like the edge of a door. She called it in an hour later. By morning, the desert had a new kind of visitor. General Adeyeze Okafor arrived with 4 transport planes and a security detachment that outnumbered the entire original survey team 3-1. She was a compact woman with iron-gray hair cut close to her scalp and eyes that missed nothing. She had spent 30 years in and out of conflict zones, and she carried herself like someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the world threw at her. This, it turned out, was about to change. "Talk to me, Doctor," Okafor said, standing over the excavation pit with her arms crossed, watching cranes lower new equipment into the widening hole. "We found a structure," Elena said. "Buried at over 2 kilometers depth, in bedrock that should be solid for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The material isn't naturally occurring. It isn't manufactured by any process we understand, and it has seams. General, I think there's something built down there. Something big." "How big?" "The magnetic anomaly stretches across 9 square kilometers." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very softly, "That's not a structure, Doctor. That's a vessel." Over the following 2 weeks, the site transformed. What had been 3 trailers and a modest drilling rig became a small city of steel containers, generators, and armed checkpoints. Ground-penetrating radar teams mapped the buried shape meter by meter, and each new scan made the room a little quieter. The object beneath the desert was not a building. It had curves where buildings had corners, and a symmetry that suggested motion, purpose, design. It looked, more than anything, like the hull of a ship, if a ship could be the size of a small mountain and sleep beneath solid rock for who knew how many thousands of years. Elena barely left the site anymore. She had stopped sending her reports up the normal academic channels weeks ago. Now everything she wrote went straight to a classified server that only Okafor and a handful of people in Geneva and Washington could access. She told herself this was simply how important discoveries were handled. She tried not to think about how frightened she was. It was Marcus who found the opening. He had been running a new sonar pass along the northern edge of the anomaly when his console lit up with an alert that made him swear loud enough for the whole trailer to hear. There's a cavity, he said. A natural one, or maybe not so natural. It runs from the surface almost straight down to the hull, like an old lava tube, except it's rimmed with the same gray material we pulled up before. You're saying there's already a way in, Okafor said. I'm saying there might be. It's narrow and unstable, and I have no idea what's waiting for us at the bottom of it. Okafor did not hesitate for long. 3 days later, a reinforced access shaft had been driven down alongside the natural cavity, braced with steel and concrete, wide enough for 2 people to descend side by side. Elena volunteered to be one of the first down. She told herself it was because she understood the site better than anyone, that her expertise made her essential to the first descent. The truth, which she admitted only to herself in the dark hours before dawn, was that she could not bear the thought of anyone else being the first to see what she had spent a month digging toward. The descent took 40 minutes in a slow-moving cage elevator, floodlights strapped to the outside throwing long shadows against rough stone walls that gradually gave way to smoother, stranger material. The air grew warmer as they went down, not colder, which defied everything Elena knew about geothermal gradients. At last the cage shuddered to a stop, and the doors opened onto a chamber that stole the breath from everyone standing in it. The hull of the ship rose above them and curved away into darkness beyond the reach of their lights, a wall of dark metal, untouched by rust or decay, despite what must have been an unimaginable span of time. Directly ahead, at the base of the natural cavity, was an opening, not a hole torn by geological forces, but a hatch, perfectly round, its edges lined with the same faint groove pattern Elena had first found on the surface fragment. "That's a door," Marcus whispered, his voice swallowed by the vast dark space around them. "That is absolutely a door." Okafor, standing beside them in full tactical gear with a sidearm on her hip that suddenly looked very small against the scale of what surrounded them, keyed her radio. "Command, this is Okafor. We have a confirmed entry point, requesting authorization to proceed." The answer that came back, after a long pause, was simple. "Authorization granted. Proceed with extreme caution. God be with you." They approached the hatch together, a party of 6. Elena, Marcus, Okafor, 2 soldiers named Petrov and Diaz, and a linguist named Dr. Chidi Nwosu who had been flown in from Lagos 3 days earlier, because someone in Geneva had insisted that if they found writing, they would need someone who could try to read it. Their footsteps echoed strangely against the ancient hull, sound behaving in ways that suggested the metal was denser than any material humans had learned to forge. There was no visible mechanism to open the hatch. No handle, no panel, nothing that resembled a control of any kind. Petrov ran his scanner over the surface and shook his head. Nothing. No power signature. This thing has been dead for longer than I want to think about. Elena stepped closer, driven by the same instinct that had made her hold the surface fragment a moment too long, back at the beginning of all this. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the cold metal, right at the center of the hatch, without really deciding to do it. She simply found herself doing it, the way a hand reaches for a doorknob without conscious thought. Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. Then a line of pale blue light traced itself along the groove pattern, faint at first, then brightening, spreading outward from beneath her palm, like frost blooming across glass. Marcus stumbled back a step. Diaz drew his weapon on pure reflex, before Okafor snapped a hand out and forced the barrel down. "Hold," Okafor said, her voice tight but steady. "Hold your fire. Everyone hold." The light steadied, and with it came a sound, low and deep, felt in the chest more than heard by the ears, like something enormous drawing a first breath after a very long sleep. The hatch did not open all at once. It rotated, slow and grinding, dust and dried mineral deposits sifting down in sheets, as ancient seals broke for the first time in who knew how many millennia. Behind it lay darkness, and from that darkness came a wave of stale, metallic air that smelled of nothing any of them could name. Chidi was the one who spoke first, his voice hushed with something between terror and wonder. It responded to her. Why did it respond to her? Elena looked down at her palm, half expecting to see it glowing, though of course it was not. "I don't know," she said. "I just touched it." Okafor studied the opening for a long moment, then unclipped a floodlight from her harness and threw its beam into the darkness beyond the hatch. What it revealed was a corridor, wide and impossibly clean despite the ages that must have passed. its walls lined with softly curved panels, and a floor marked with faint lines of the same pale light that had opened the door, now pulsing gently, as if the entire vessel were slowly, cautiously, waking up around them. "We go in pairs," Okafor said. "Petrov, Diaz, you're with me on point. Dr. Voss, Dr. Nwosu, Marcus, stay behind us, and stay close. If anything moves, anything at all, you fall back to the elevator immediately. Are we clear?" They were clear. Nobody argued. Nobody, in that moment, wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The corridor sloped gently downward, curving in a way that made it impossible to see more than 30 meters ahead at any time. The pulsing lines of light along the floor seemed to lead them forward, brightening just ahead of their steps and dimming behind, as if the ship itself were guiding them, or perhaps simply reacting to their presence, the way a house's motion sensor lights might react to a passing car. Elena kept glancing at the walls, searching for the seams and markings she had grown used to on the surface. But here, the material was different, smoother, worked with a level of precision that made her hands ache to touch it and learn how it had been made. They found the first chamber 20 minutes later. It opened suddenly, the corridor widening into a vast circular room whose ceiling vanished into shadow far above the reach of their lights. Around its edges stood row upon row of tall alcoves, each one holding a shape that might once have been armor, or might have been something else entirely, humanoid in outline but subtly wrong in the proportions, taller than any human, with limbs a fraction too long, and shoulders built for something heavier than what humans carried. "Are those bodies?" Diaz asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't think so," Chidi said slowly, moving closer to one of the alcoves despite Okafor's sharp warning to hold position. "Look at the joints. This is a suit. Armor, maybe, or a uniform of some kind. Empty." Elena approached the nearest alcove herself, ignoring the tightening in her chest that told her this was exactly the sort of thing that got people killed in every story she had ever read about places like this. The suit within was dark, matte, marked along one shoulder with an emblem that had faded but not vanished, some symbol worked in the same pale material as the corridor's guide lights. She leaned closer, and her breath caught in her throat. It was not an alien symbol. It was, unmistakably, imperfectly, but undeniably, the shape of a flag. Not any flag she recognized specifically, but a flag, a rectangle, with a simple emblem at its corner, the universal shorthand that every human culture on Earth had independently arrived at, to mark something as belonging to a people, a nation, a cause. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "get this on camera. Get all of this on camera. Right now." He did, his hands shaking slightly as he raised the recorder. Behind them, Okafor had gone very still, staring at the same emblem with an expression Elena had never seen on the general's face before. It was not confusion. It was something closer to dawning, terrible understanding. "General," Petrov said quietly. "Orders?" Okafor did not answer immediately. She was looking past the alcoves, deeper into the chamber, where the pulsing guide lights converged toward a raised platform at the room's center, and upon that platform stood something that had not been visible from the entrance. A column of dark crystal, taller than a person, humming faintly, with the same pale light that ran through the ship's veins. "We keep moving," Okafor said finally, slowly, together. They crossed the chamber in silence, weapons ready, cameras recording, 6 frightened and fascinated humans walking through the bones of something ancient and vast. As they neared the crystal column, the humming grew louder, resolving slowly into something that was almost, but not quite, a sound with structure. A rhythm, perhaps even, though none of them wanted to say it aloud, something like a voice trying to remember how to speak. Elena stopped a few meters from the column, closer than anyone else dared go, and found herself once again reaching out her hand without deciding to. "Elena," Okafor warned. "Don't." "I have to," Elena said, and she was surprised to hear that she meant it, that some part of her had known since she pulled that first gray fragment out of the desert floor, that this moment was coming, that she had been walking toward it for weeks without understanding why. "It answered me at the door. I don't think it's finished answering." Her fingers touched the crystal surface, and the chamber went white. It was not an explosion. There was no heat, no force, nothing that threw her backward or burned her skin. It was simply light, absolute and total, filling every corner of the vast room in an instant, so bright that even through closed eyelids Elena could see nothing but searing white. She heard Okafor shouting orders, heard Diaz and Petrov's weapons clatter as they were knocked from startled hands, heard Chidi cry out in alarm. And beneath all of it, rising slowly, building like the first notes of some impossibly deep instrument, came a sound that resolved, syllable by careful syllable, into words. Unit. Designation. Requested, the voice said, vast and slow, as if each sound costed enormous effort to produce after so long a silence. Identity. Confirmed. The light began to fade, the whiteness receding into the pale blue glow the ship had shown them all along, and as Elena's vision cleared, she saw that the crystal column had changed. Deep within it, something like an eye, or perhaps a star, had opened, and it was watching her. Flag, the voice said, softer now, almost gentle, recognized. Elena's knees nearly gave out beneath her. Somewhere behind her, she heard Okafor issue a command to hold position, hold fire, hold everything, in a voice that shook for the first time since Elena had met her. What are you? Elena managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely more than a breath. The light within the crystal pulsed once, slow and steady, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after a long sleep. I am the warden, it said. I have been waiting. Nobody in that chamber moved for a long, long moment. Then Chidi, ever the linguist, ever unable to stop himself from asking the next question, even in the face of the impossible, whispered, waiting for what? The light in the crystal turned toward him, slow and deliberate, and when the warden answered, its voice carried something that might have been sorrow, or might have been relief, or might have been both at once. For you, it said, for all of you, I was told this day would come. I did not believe I would live to see it. Far above them, unnoticed by anyone in the chamber, the guide lights along every corridor of the ancient vessel had begun, one by one, section by section, to brighten, as if the whole enormous ship was slowly opening its eyes for the first time in 10,000 years. Okafor was the first of them to recover her voice. She had spent 3 decades learning how to keep a level head when the world tried to tear itself apart around her, and though nothing in that experience had prepared her for a talking column of light buried 2 kilometers under the Gobi Desert, old habits held. She lowered her weapon, though she did not holster it, and stepped forward until she stood beside Elena. You said you were waiting, Okafor said. Waiting for humanity specifically, or waiting for anyone who might find you? The light within the crystal shifted, slow and thoughtful, as though the warden were choosing its words with great care, relearning a language it had not used in a very long time. For your people, it said, only for your people. I was sealed here long before your cities existed, long before your species had a name for itself. I was left as a promise that one day, you would come back to this place, and be ready to hear the truth of what you are. What does that mean? It means, the warden said, that you did not begin here by accident. The words hung in the chamber, vast and terrible, and impossible to fully understand all at once. Elena felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She had come into this desert chasing a magnetic anomaly, and a professional curiosity about rare minerals. She was leaving that version of herself behind, with every second that passed in this room. We need to be careful here, Okafor said quietly, though she was speaking as much to herself as to the others. Whatever this thing is, whatever it says it wants, it is a weapon. Look around you. This chamber is full of armor, built for soldiers 3 meters tall. That column of light called itself a warden. We do not know yet if that word means protector, or something else entirely. I understand your caution, the warden said, and there was something almost like patience in its slow, resonant voice. I would carry the same caution, were our positions reversed. I will not ask you to trust me today. I ask only that you allow me to show you enough truth, that trust becomes possible in time. Petrov, who had said very little since the light first flared, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. General, with respect, I don't think we're in a position to argue with something the size of a mountain that just called us its promise. Okafor allowed herself something close to a grim smile. No, I don't suppose we are. She looked to Elena. Dr. Voss, you're the one it responded to. Ask it what it wants us to know. Elena swallowed hard, and turned back to the crystal. "Warden, tell us what you are. Tell us what this ship is, and why it's here, under our planet, and not somewhere else." The light pulsed, slow and deliberate, and when it answered, the chamber itself seemed to grow quieter, as if the ancient vessel were holding its breath along with them. "I am a vessel of the Concord," it said. "A gathering of many peoples, joined long ago in common purpose, who found your world in its early age, and recognized in it something rare, a cradle, a place where life had taken root with unusual strength and unusual promise. The Concord did not conquer your world, nor did it rule over it. It watched, it protected. And in time, it took a small number of your ancestors, with their consent freely given, to serve among its ranks, so that when the day came that your species was ready to look to the stars, there would already be those among the void who remembered where they came from, and who would stand as a bridge between your people and the wider dark." Marcus, still recording everything with hands that had finally stopped shaking, made a small, disbelieving sound. "You're saying humans have been out there, already, for thousands of years?" "A very small number," the warden said, "chosen carefully, and honored greatly, though the honor cost them everything they had once known. I was their vessel. I was built and crewed in part by their hands, and I carried the mark of your world as my own, so that should I ever return here, I would be recognized by whoever found me not as an invader, but as something that belonged, in some small way, to this place." "The flag," Elena said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. "That's why it lit up when I touched the door. That's why the armor in the alcoves carries the emblem. It isn't a coincidence that it looks like a flag. It's not alien at all. Some part of it is us." "Yes," the warden said, and for the first time, something like warmth crept into its vast, slow voice. "I recognized the flag your people still carry, faint and worn as the memory of it had become, across so many generations, because it was given to me by those very hands, long ago, so that I might one day come home and be known." Okafor exhaled slowly, and Elena could see the general recalculating everything, every assumption she had walked into this chamber with. "Why are you here now?" Okafor asked, "and not 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years from now? Why this moment?" The light in the crystal dimmed briefly, and when it spoke again, there was something heavier in its tone, something that sounded, despite its size and strangeness, uncomfortably close to grief. "Because the Concord that built me no longer exists," the warden said. "It was destroyed, long ago, by an enemy that even now I do not fully understand, though I fought against it until my crew was gone and my systems failed, and I could do nothing but bury myself here, beneath the world I was sworn to protect, and wait. I was built to wake only when your people had grown enough, in number and in unity, to stand a chance of hearing what I have to tell you without being destroyed by the knowledge. Your recent history, the growth of your cities, your reach toward orbit and beyond, triggered the deep sensors I left dormant across this world. That is why I woke now, and not before." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Diaz, who had not said a word since the light first flared, finally broke the silence, his voice small in the vast chamber. "What enemy? What destroyed something big enough to make a ship like this afraid?" The crystal's light flickered once, sharp and sudden, like a wince. "That," the warden said, "is a conversation for when you are ready to hear it. And I fear, though I take no pleasure in saying so, that you may not have as much time to prepare as either of us would wish." Okafor's jaw tightened. She looked around at the vast chamber, at the rows of empty armor built for giants who had once, however briefly, called this ship home, and at the small, frightened, determined group of humans standing at its heart. "Then we'd better get started," she said. 3 days after the warden spoke its first words, the desert above the buried ship had become the most heavily guarded patch of ground on the entire planet. News of the discovery had not been made public. Officially, the site was still a rare earth mineral survey, and the increased military presence was explained away as protection against foreign espionage. Unofficially, a rotating cast of presidents, prime ministers, and generals had begun arriving, in unmarked planes, at a small airstrip 40 kilometers away, driven in under cover of night to see, with their own eyes, the thing that Elena Voss and her small team had found sleeping beneath the sand. Elena herself had barely left the chamber since that first encounter. She had been given a proper title now, Lead Contact Specialist, a term some committee in Geneva had invented, because nobody could agree on what to call the person whose hand a 10,000-year-old alien warship had chosen to answer. She did not mind the strange title. She minded, more than she let anyone see, the weight of being the person the warden seemed most willing to speak to. "You look tired," General Okafor said, dropping into the seat across from her in the makeshift briefing room that had been built into a shipping container at the mouth of the access shaft. Behind Okafor, a wall of monitors displayed live feeds from 6 different points inside the ship, the corridors and chambers now fully lit in soft blue-white light, humming gently, with power that should not have existed after 10 millennia of dormancy. "I haven't slept much," Elena admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I keep hearing that voice. Waiting for you." "Get used to that feeling," Okafor said dryly. "I don't think it's going away." She slid a tablet across the table. "The warden gave us access to a data archive last night. Dr. Nwosu and his team have been working through it for 6 hours straight. You need to see what they found before the next briefing with the Security Council." Elena took the tablet and scrolled through pages of translated text, some of it clearly still rough, awkward phrasing where Chidi's linguistic algorithms had struggled to find the right human words for concepts that had no direct equivalent. But the shape of the story was clear enough, and it made her stomach drop with every line. The Concord, the alliance the warden had described, had spanned dozens of star systems and hundreds of worlds, bound together not by conquest, but by a shared understanding that certain young civilizations, certain fragile cradles of life, deserved protection while they grew strong enough to protect themselves. Earth had been one such cradle, watched over quietly for longer than human recorded history stretched back. The small number of humans taken to serve among the Concord's ranks, the ones the warden called its crew, had lived and died among the stars, their names lost to human memory, but preserved, apparently, in the warden's own archives. "There are names in here," Elena said quietly, scrolling further. "Actual names, human names, from thousands of years ago. It kept records of every person who ever served aboard it." "I saw," Okafor said. "Chidi thinks some of the oldest names might correspond to figures from early oral histories, names that survived as myths and legends long after any factual memory of them was lost. Heroes, ancestors, half-remembered gods." Elena sat back, the weight of it settling over her slowly. "You're saying some of our oldest stories might be distorted memories of real people who were taken up there? That the Concord is why so many ancient cultures across the world, cultures that never had any contact with each other, all have similar stories about beings who came from the sky and changed everything?" "I'm not saying anything," Okafor said. "I'm telling you what the data suggests, and reminding you that we don't yet know how much of it we can trust. This ship wants something from us. I don't know what yet, but it's telling us a story that makes us feel special, chosen, important. Ships built by militaries, even alien ones, don't usually bother making the people they're recruiting feel good about themselves unless they need something from them." Elena considered that, and found she could not entirely disagree. So what does it need? That's what we're about to find out. They descended together an hour later, joining Chidi, Marcus, and a dozen new specialists who had been flown in over the past 3 days. Xenolinguists, structural engineers, weapons analysts, and 2 quiet men, from an agency neither Elena nor Marcus had ever heard of, who did not offer their names, and did not need to. The corridor leading to the central chamber had changed since their first descent. Sections of wall panel had opened on their own, revealing consoles and displays that lit at their approach, as though the ship itself were eager to be understood. The warden's crystal column pulsed gently as they entered, its light brightening in a way that Elena had come to recognize, over the past 3 days, as something like a greeting. "Dr. Voss," it said, the vast voice noticeably smoother now, more fluent, as though each conversation helped it relearn the shape of human language a little more completely. "You returned sooner than I expected. I am glad of it. There is much to discuss." "We read the archive you gave us," Elena said. "Some of it anyway. Chidi's team thinks they've barely scratched the surface." "There is far more," the warden agreed. "I have preserved 10,000 years of record. It will take your scholars a lifetime to study all of it properly, and I do not believe you have a lifetime to spare before the more urgent matters must be addressed." Okafor stepped forward, arms crossed. her posture radiating the same careful skepticism she had carried into every meeting since the first encounter. "Then let's address them. You told us there was an enemy. Something that destroyed the alliance that built you. We need to know what it is, how dangerous it is, and why we should believe it's still relevant to us today, 10,000 years after the fact." The light within the crystal dimmed slightly, and when the warden spoke again, its tone had shifted, grown heavier, more careful. "The Concord called them the Marrow," it said. "I do not know their true name for themselves, if such a thing exists. They were not a single civilization in the way yours or the Concord's member peoples were. They were closer to a plague that had learned to think. A swarm intelligence that consumed worlds, not for resources alone, but to erase the information those worlds represented. Cultures, languages, histories, entire ways of understanding existence, unmade and absorbed into their collective mass. They did not conquer as your empires once conquered, seeking land and tribute. They erased, seeking nothing but the silence that came after." Marcus, standing near the back of the group with his recorder held loosely at his side, had gone very pale. "How do you erase an entire civilization?" "Slowly at first," the warden said. "The Marrow do not announce their arrival with fire from the sky, not when patience serves them better. They arrive quietly, seed themselves into a civilization's information networks, its trust, its institutions, and unravel it from within long before any fleet is required. By the time a world realizes what has taken root among them, it is very often already too late to stop what comes next." A cold silence spread through the chamber. Even Okafor, who Elena had never once seen rattled, stood very still, her jaw set tight. "And they found the Concord," Elena said quietly. "They found the Concord," the warden confirmed. "After nearly 900 of your years, spreading unnoticed through worlds we believed secure." When the truth was finally understood, the war that followed lasted decades and cost more lives than I have numbers sufficient to express in terms your language would find meaningful. I fought in that war. I was built for that war, alongside 11 sister vessels of my class. I am the last of them still capable of speech. "What happened to the others?" Chidi asked softly. "Destroyed," the warden said. "Or worse. Some were captured and turned, their crews consumed, their systems corrupted, to serve the very enemy they had been built to fight. I do not know if any of my sisters still function somewhere in the dark. I have hoped, across 10,000 years of silence, that I was wrong to fear the worst. I have had little reason for that hope." Okafor let out a slow breath. "You said you fled here, to Earth, and buried yourself. Why here? Why not somewhere else, somewhere that might have offered better defenses, or allies who could still fight?" "Because this was the one place the Marrow had not yet found," the warden said. "Earth's location was among the most closely guarded secrets the Concord possessed. Precisely because it was a cradle world, precisely because its people were not yet ready to defend themselves, the Concord shielded its location with every resource available. When my sister vessels fell and the war was clearly lost, I made the only choice that gave your world any chance at survival. I came home, hid myself beneath the surface, sealed away every system that might broadcast my location, and waited in silence, hoping the Marrow's attention would move elsewhere before they thought to search for what the Concord had been protecting all along." "And did it work?" Okafor asked, her voice low and hard. "Did their attention move elsewhere?" The warden's light flickered, and for the first time since it had woken, Elena thought she heard something that sounded almost like fear in its ancient voice. "For a time," it said, "but my activation 3 days ago was not silent. Waking my primary systems required a burst of energy that any sufficiently attentive listener across a great distance might, in time, detect and trace back to its source. I do not know if the Marrow still search for the Concord's lost worlds. I do not know if they retain any memory of me at all, after 10,000 years. But I would be doing your people a great disservice if I told you the danger had certainly passed, when in truth, I cannot promise any such thing." The room absorbed this in heavy silence. Elena felt the ground of her understanding shift again, the way it had shifted in the moment she first pressed her palm to the ship's hatch. This was no longer simply a story about ancient history and half-remembered myths. This was a warning, wrapped carefully inside a history lesson, delivered by something that had clearly been weighing exactly how much truth humanity could bear to hear all at once. "You're telling us," Okafor said slowly. That by waking you up, we may have already announced our location to the very thing that destroyed the civilization that built you. I am telling you, the warden said, that it is a possibility I cannot rule out, and one I believe you deserve to know, however difficult it may be to hear. I would rather you distrust me for delivering hard truths than trust me falsely, because I chose comfortable silence instead. Okafor turned to Elena, and for the first time since this whole affair had begun, Elena saw something in the general's expression that looked uncomfortably close to fear held carefully in check. Well, Okafor said quietly, I suppose that answers the question of why it woke now, and why it needs us. It is not only that I need you, the warden said, and its voice, vast as it was, carried something unmistakably close to gentleness. I have spent 10,000 years alone beneath this world, guarding a cradle whose children I never saw grow. I have wondered, across all that silence, what kind of people you would become. I find, now that I have finally woken to meet you, that I am glad beyond anything I can properly express in your language that you are still here, and that you found me, and that whatever comes next, you will not face it without at least the small help I am still capable of giving. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Okafor straightened her shoulders, the fear in her expression folding back beneath the same iron discipline that had carried her through 30 years of crises most people never heard about. All right, she said, then let's talk about what help you can actually give us, because if there's even a chance that something out there is coming to finish what it started 10,000 years ago, we need every advantage we can get, and we need it fast. The warden's light brightened, steady and resolute, and around the chamber, unseen consoles across the ancient vessel began, one by one, to hum to life. Then let us begin, it said, with my weapons. The lights along the chamber floor brightened and split into two new lines, branching away from the central platform, toward a section of the ship none of them had yet explored. The warden's voice took on a different quality as it spoke, something almost like pride threading through the careful weight of everything it had just revealed. Follow the light, it said. I will show you what remains of me, and you may judge for yourselves what use it might be to your people. They walked in silence for nearly 10 minutes, the corridor sloping downward and widening steadily until it opened into a chamber, even larger than the one that housed the warden's core. Here, row upon row of long, dark shapes lay cradled in recessed berths along both walls, each one longer than a city bus, their surfaces marked with the same faint groove patterns that ran through the rest of the ship. Above them, suspended from a ceiling lost in darkness, hung something far larger still, a shape Elena's mind struggled at first to properly parse. Are those turrets? Marcus asked, his voice hushed. Primary armament, the warden confirmed. 6 batteries of directed energy weapons, each capable of projecting force, sufficient to breach the hull of a vessel the size of my own, from a distance of several thousand kilometers. They have not fired in 10,000 years. I do not know, with certainty, that all of them will still function, but my internal diagnostics suggest that 4 of the 6 remain fully operational, and a 5th may be restored with sufficient repair. Okafor walked slowly along the row of dormant weapons, her hand hovering near the surface of one without quite touching it, the way a person might approach something they were afraid to wake. And the 6th? Destroyed, the warden said simply. In the battle that brought me here, I carry the scar of that wound still, though your engineers have not yet had reason to see it. One of the quiet men from the unnamed agency, who had said almost nothing since their descent began, finally spoke, his voice flat and careful. What kind of yield are we talking about, in terms our physicists could actually measure and understand? I could provide numbers, the warden said, though I suspect they would mean little without proper context. Allow me instead to offer a comparison. A single sustained discharge from one of my primary batteries would be sufficient to vaporize the largest warship currently in service among your nations before its crew had time to register the attack had begun. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Elena watched the color drain slightly from more than one face in the group, and understood, for the first time in a way that went beyond abstract history lessons, exactly what kind of power was sleeping in the dark beneath their feet. That's not a weapon, Okafor said quietly. That's a small nation's worth of destructive force sitting in a hole in the ground. It is a weapon built to fight something that erases civilizations, the warden said, and there was no apology in its voice. only a kind of tired honesty. I was not built for restraint. I was built to survive an enemy that gave no quarter and expected none in return. I understand that this may frighten you. I would ask only that you consider what frightens you more: a weapon capable of defending your world, or the absence of any weapon at all, should the thing I warned you about ever choose to look this way again. Nobody had a good answer to that. Chidi, ever the one to reach for understanding rather than fear, stepped closer to the nearest dormant weapon and studied the faint markings along its casing. These symbols, are they operating instructions? Could we learn to use these ourselves, or do they require you specifically to function? Both, in a sense, the warden said. The weapons themselves can be operated by trained crew, human or otherwise, given sufficient instruction. I have preserved training records from my original crew that could shorten that process considerably. But full integration of my systems, targeting, power distribution, structural coordination across the whole vessel, requires an intelligence capable of processing information at a scale your current technology does not yet match. That is a role I alone can fill, unless your engineers develop something comparable in time. Okafor exchanged a glance with the two quiet men from the agency, a silent conversation that Elena could not fully read but understood the shape of well enough. This was no longer simply a scientific discovery. This was a question of sovereignty, of control, of who, exactly, would hold the keys to a weapon capable of erasing armies with a single shot. We're going to need to bring this to the Security Council in full, Okafor said finally. Not the sanitized version. Everything. The marrow, the Concord, the weapons, all of it. This is bigger than any one nation's decision to make alone. I expected as much, the warden said. I would ask only one thing in return, General Okafor, and I ask it not as a demand, but as a request, born of long and painful experience. Whatever decisions your leaders make in the days ahead, do not let fear of each other blind you to the danger that may yet be coming from beyond your sky. The Concord did not fall to the marrow alone. It fell because its member worlds spent too many precious years arguing over who should hold power, who should be trusted, who should lead, while the enemy grew stronger in the shadows between their disputes. I would not see your world repeat that same mistake. Elena felt the weight of those words settle over the chamber like a physical thing. She thought of the news reports she used to half listen to before this whole affair began. The endless disputes between nations over resources, borders, ideology. Disputes that had felt, at the time, like the permanent and unavoidable texture of human existence. She wondered, for the first time, whether any of that would matter at all, if something like the marrow ever turned its attention back toward Earth. We'll do our best, Okafor said, and though her voice was steady, Elena thought she heard, underneath it, the same private doubt she herself was feeling. That's all I can promise you tonight. The warden's light dimmed to a low, steady glow, patient and unhurried, in a way that only something which had already waited 10,000 years could manage. Then I will wait a little longer, it said. I have grown rather good at waiting. They climbed back to the surface, as dawn broke over the desert, the sky turning the color of pale fire above the endless flat horizon. Elena stood at the mouth of the access shaft for a long moment, watching the light spread slowly across the sand, and found herself thinking not of weapons or war, but of the names Chidi's team had found buried in the warden's archives, ordinary human names from thousands of years ago, people who had once walked across ground very much like this before being carried off to serve among the stars. She wondered what they would think, if they could see this moment, whether they would recognize anything at all in the frightened, determined, quietly hopeful faces of the people standing now at the threshold of the ship they had once called home. Behind her, Okafor's phone buzzed with an incoming call marked urgent, routed directly from Geneva. The general answered, listened for a long moment, her expression tightening with every word, and then looked back toward Elena, with an expression that made the morning's fragile calm evaporate all at once. They want us in Geneva by tomorrow night, Okafor said. Full briefing. Every head of state that can get there in time. Someone leaked partial data to 3 intelligence agencies overnight. The story's already starting to move faster than we can control it. Elena felt her stomach drop. And the warden's warning? About the marrow possibly already knowing where we are? Okafor's jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked, despite everything, simply tired. A woman carrying a weight far too large for any single person to bear alone. That, she said quietly, is exactly what I'm afraid Geneva is about to find out the hard way. Far above the desert, unnoticed by anyone still gathering their equipment at the mouth of the shaft, a satellite passed silently overhead, its sensors tuned to frequencies no human agency had built it to detect. And somewhere far beyond the edge of the solar system, something ancient and patient turned its attention, for the first time in 10,000 years, toward a small, blue, unremarkable world it had once been ordered never to forget. The room in Geneva had never been designed to hold this many heads of state at once, and it showed. Extra chairs had been crammed along the walls, translators crowded into a side booth working in shifts, and somewhere in the chaos, a junior aide had fainted from the sheer pressure of the moment, before the meeting had even properly begun. Elena stood near the back, feeling entirely out of place among presidents and prime ministers and generals, her hands wrapped tightly around a tablet that held 3 days' worth of translated Warden archive data, the only weapon she had ever really carried in her life. Okafor stood at the front of the room, beside a large screen displaying a live feed from the buried chamber deep beneath the Gobi Desert. The warden's crystal column pulsed softly in the image, patient and silent, waiting to be asked to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Okafor began, her voice carrying easily across the crowded room, without need of amplification. "What I am about to tell you will sound, at first, like the plot of a film. I ask that you listen to the end before you decide how to react." She told them everything. The buried vessel, the crew of ancient humans taken from Earth long before recorded history began, the Concorde, and its long, quiet stewardship of a cradle world it had sworn to protect. She told them about the marrow, about civilizations erased not by fire from orbit, but by patient corruption from within, about a war that had cost the Concorde everything, and about a ship that had come home to hide, and wait, and hope its people would one day be ready to hear the truth. By the time she reached the warning, that the warden's activation might already have alerted whatever remained of an enemy capable of consuming entire civilizations, the room had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that comes not from calm but from the particular stillness of people trying very hard not to panic in front of their peers. It was the President of the United States who spoke first, her voice carefully measured despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "General Okafor, I want to be direct. Are you telling us that by finding this ship we may have brought an extinction-level threat down on our own heads?" "I am telling you what the warden told us," Okafor said. "It cannot promise the marrow have noticed. It also cannot promise they have not. What it can promise is that if they have, we will need every resource this planet possesses to have any chance at all, and that resource includes the ship itself." A representative from the Chinese delegation raised a hand, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime learning not to show his cards too early. "And who, precisely, controls this weapon, once it is operational? A single nation's military? An international body? The alien intelligence itself?" "That," Okafor said, "is exactly the question I hoped this room would help me answer, because I do not believe any one government on Earth has the standing to claim sole ownership of something that predates every nation, currently represented in this room by several thousand years." The argument that followed lasted nearly 6 hours. Elena had expected disagreement. She had not expected the sheer scale of it, the way old rivalries and half-buried grievances surfaced again and again beneath the surface of every proposal, the way delegations that had spent decades building careful alliances suddenly eyed each other with fresh suspicion the moment a weapon capable of reshaping the balance of global power entered the conversation. Someone suggested the ship be placed under a new international command structure, modeled loosely on old nuclear oversight bodies. Someone else pointed out, not unreasonably, that such bodies had a long history of gridlock, precisely when speed mattered most. A third delegation quietly floated the idea that whichever nation currently held physical custody of the site should simply retain control, an idea that was shot down almost instantly by everyone else in the room. Through all of it, Elena kept thinking of the warden's warning. It fell because its member worlds spent too many precious years arguing over who should hold power, while the enemy grew stronger in the shadows between their disputes. She had not fully believed, when she first heard those words, that humanity would prove the warden right quite so quickly, or quite so thoroughly. It was Chidi, of all people, who finally broke the deadlock, standing quietly at the edge of the room, until Okafor noticed him and gestured for the floor. "If I may," Chidi said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I would like to remind everyone in this room of something." The warden did not wake for any single nation. It woke because Dr. Voss touched its hull, a private citizen, a scientist, not a soldier or a diplomat. And when it spoke its first words, it did not ask for a president or a prime minister. It said, "I have been waiting for you, all of you. I do not think this ship recognizes the borders we have drawn on our own planet. I think, if we ask it directly, it might have a suggestion for how this could be managed that none of us in this room have thought to consider, precisely because it does not carry any of our particular histories or biases." The room considered this in silence for a long moment. Finally, the President of the United States turned to the screen, where the warden's light pulsed patiently, having listened, Elena realized, to every word of the argument without once interrupting. "Warden," the President said, "you've heard all of this. Do you have anything to add?" The light brightened slightly, and when it spoke, its vast, slow voice carried a weight that seemed to still the entire room, in a way 6 hours of human argument had failed to achieve. "I have listened," the warden said, "and I understand the fear beneath your disagreement, because I have seen this same fear destroy far older and far wiser councils than this one. I will not choose your leaders for you, nor will I claim ownership of myself on behalf of any single nation. But I will say this: I was built to serve a purpose larger than any one people's ambition. I ask that whichever structure you choose to build around me reflect that same principle. Let no single nation hold sole command of my weapons. Let representatives from every corner of your world share responsibility for what I might one day be asked to do, so that the decision to act, should it ever come, belongs to humanity as a whole, and not to the ambitions of any one part of it." The suggestion was simple, and in its simplicity, it cut through hours of tangled argument in a way nothing else had managed. By the time the sun rose over Geneva the following morning, a framework had been agreed upon, hastily drafted but genuinely binding, a joint command council, drawing representatives from every permanent member of the Security Council, alongside rotating seats for smaller nations, would oversee what was now being called, in careful diplomatic language, the Sentinel Project. Okafor would serve as its first field commander, a role nobody in the room seriously contested, given the trust she had already earned managing the Discovery from its earliest days. Elena, to her own considerable surprise, was named Chief Liaison to the Warden itself, a title that felt both absurd and, somehow, entirely correct. It was not perfect. Elena could see the cracks in the agreement even as it was signed, old rivalries barely papered over, trust extended more out of necessity than genuine faith. But it was, for the first time in longer than Elena could remember reading about in any history book, something close to unity, forged not by shared ideology or shared culture, but by the shared and sudden understanding that the alternative might genuinely mean the end of everything. They returned to the Gobi Desert 3 days later, the site transformed once again, now openly recognized as an international facility, its perimeter patrolled by a rotating multinational force, its corridors slowly filling with engineers and scientists from a dozen different nations working side by side, often through translators, sometimes through nothing more than shared diagrams and patient goodwill, to understand what the warden had to teach them. Elena descended to the central chamber on the evening of their return, exhausted but unable to sleep, drawn by the same instinct that had brought her back again and again since that very first hand pressed against cold, ancient metal. "You look as though the surface world has not treated you gently," the warden observed as she entered, its light brightening in what she had come to recognize, unmistakably now, as genuine welcome. "They argued for 6 hours, Elena said, sitting down heavily on the low platform near the crystal column. 6 hours, deciding how to share you fairly, while somewhere out there, something that erased an entire alliance of worlds might already be coming this way. 6 hours is not so long," the warden said gently. "I have seen councils argue for years over decisions that mattered far less. That your people reached agreement in 6 hours, faced with a threat this unfamiliar, speaks better of you than you seem willing to believe." Elena managed a tired, humorless laugh. "Chidi's the one who saved it, really. He reminded them that you didn't wake up for any one country. Just for us, all of us." "He spoke truly," the warden said, "though I confess, Dr. Voss, That when I say I woke for all of you, I do not mean it only in the abstract sense your councils have chosen to interpret it. I mean it in the sense that matters most to me personally. I woke because a hand touched my hull with curiosity, rather than fear, and asked nothing of me before offering, freely, her own attention and care. That is a rare thing, in my long experience of the universe. I do not think it belongs to any flag or nation. I think it belongs to you, specifically, and I am glad it was you who found me first. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, that she was too tired to properly name. I didn't do anything special. I just happened to be the one standing there. Perhaps, the warden said. Or perhaps the ones who happen to be standing there, in the moments that matter most, are rarely there entirely by accident. I have learned, across 10,000 years, to be suspicious of the word simply, particularly when it is used to explain away the things that turn out to matter most. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the chamber's soft blue light pulsing gently around them, until Elena finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since Geneva. Warden, be honest with me. Do you think they're coming? The marrow. Do you think they already know we're here? The light dimmed slightly, and when the warden answered, its voice carried the particular gentleness of something choosing honesty over comfort, exactly as it had promised, all those days ago, that it always would. I do not know, it said. I have run every projection my systems can manage, and the honest answer is that I cannot give you certainty either way. But I would be doing you no kindness to pretend the danger has passed, simply because it is easier to sleep at night believing so. I will tell you what I have told your leaders. Prepare as though they are already on their way, and hope, with everything left in me to hope with, that we are given more time than that fear allows. Elena nodded slowly, staring into the crystal's pulsing light, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not as frightened as she perhaps should have been. Somewhere above them, engineers from a dozen nations were already working through the night to understand weapon systems built by an alliance long since gone to dust. Somewhere in Geneva, leaders who had spent decades distrusting each other had, for one fragile moment, chosen to share the weight of an impossible burden, rather than fight over who deserved to carry it alone. It was not much, it was not certain, but it was something, and after 10,000 years of silence, Elena thought, perhaps something was exactly what the warden had been waiting to see. Then we'd better get to work, she said, rising to her feet. Show me everything. All of it. If they're coming, I want us as ready as we can possibly be. The warden's light brightened, warm and resolute, and across the vast sleeping body of the ship, section by section, more systems stirred quietly awake, as though the old vessel itself understood, in whatever way something built from crystal and ancient metal could understand, that the long wait was finally, truly, drawing to its end. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Elena had ever experienced, a strange blend of exhausting labor and quiet wonder that left her falling into her cot each night too tired to dream. Teams of engineers from Japan, Brazil, Germany, and a dozen other nations worked shoulder to shoulder in the ship's weapons chamber, learning to read displays that had been designed for hands built slightly differently than their own, adapting old muscle memory to controls that responded to concepts human engineering had never needed words for before. Progress was slow and often frustrating, but it was progress, and every small success, a targeting array brought back online, a damaged relay repaired with parts fabricated in a machine shop in Ohio and flown halfway around the world within a day, felt like a small victory against the vast uncertainty hanging over all of them. Okafor drove the effort with the same relentless discipline she brought to everything, sleeping less than anyone Elena had ever met, present in nearly every briefing, every repair session, every late-night argument between engineers from nations that had spent decades distrusting one another's technology. Slowly, painstakingly, something like genuine cooperation began to take root, not because old suspicions had vanished, but because the scale of what they were facing together made those suspicions feel, for the first time in most of their careers, genuinely beside the point. The warden, for its part, proved a patient and generous teacher. It did not simply hand over knowledge. It explained, carefully and at length, the reasoning behind every system, every safeguard, every principle of design, as though it understood that trust built through shared understanding would serve them all better than trust demanded through simple obedience. Elena spent hours each day at its side, translating between its vast, careful phrasing and the more clipped, practical language of the engineers, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she had come to think of those hours as the best part of every long, difficult day. "You are different when you speak with the engineers than when you speak with me," the warden observed one evening, as the last of the day's repair teams filed out of the weapons chamber, leaving Elena alone with the crystal column's soft, steady light. "How do you mean?" she asked, settling onto the low platform, more tired than she wanted to admit. "With them, you are precise, careful. You choose your words as though each one carries a cost that must be justified. With me, you allow yourself to simply speak, without first weighing whether the words are useful. I find I have come to value that difference a great deal." Elena smiled, despite her exhaustion. "Maybe it's because you're the only one down here who isn't asking me to solve a problem every time I open my mouth." "Perhaps," the warden said. "Or perhaps it is because some part of you has already decided to trust me, even as the rest of your people continue to weigh that question carefully. I do not say this to flatter myself. I say it because I think it matters, in times like these, to notice where trust has already quietly taken root, so that it may be tended rather than taken for granted." She thought about that long after she'd climbed back to the surface that night, standing alone beneath a vast desert sky, thick with more stars than she had ever properly learned to name, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, how many of those distant points of light hid worlds like the ones the warden had described. Worlds that had once flourished under the Concorde's quiet protection. Worlds that no longer existed at all. It was General Okafor who found her there, some time later, a mug of coffee in each hand, offering one silently, before settling beside her on the cool sand. "Chidi's team finished decoding another archive segment tonight," Okafor said. "Battle records mostly. Tactics the Concorde used against the Marrow before things went badly. It's not pleasant reading." "Is any of it useful?" Elena asked. "Some of it. Enough that I've asked half our engineering staff to start cross-referencing it against our own doctrine. If the Marrow really are what the warden says they are, conventional strategy isn't going to be enough. We're going to need every advantage that ship can give us, and we're going to need our own people thinking in ways we've never had reason to think before." Elena studied the general's profile in the dim starlight, noting, not for the first time, the particular exhaustion that had settled over Okafor these past weeks, the weight of carrying a burden that had, in some very real sense, become the responsibility of an entire species, rather than any single command structure. "Do you think we're ready?" Elena asked quietly. "If they really are coming?" Okafor was silent for a long moment, turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands. "I think," she said finally, "that readiness is rarely a state you achieve so much as a direction you keep moving toward, one difficult day at a time. 3 months ago, I would have told you humanity was nowhere near ready for something like this. Today, watching engineers from 4 different continents argue over targeting algorithms, like old colleagues instead of rivals, I think we might be a little closer than I expected." She paused. "Whether we're close enough is a question I genuinely can't answer yet." They sat together in silence beneath the desert sky a while longer, until the cold finally drove them both back toward the warmth of the camp, unaware that far above them, in the vast dark beyond the reach of any human telescope, a sensor buoy the warden had left dormant across the cold edges of the solar system 10,000 years earlier had, at that very moment, detected something it had been built, long ago, to fear above all else. A signal, faint but unmistakable, moving steadily inward through the dark, carrying within its structure a pattern the ancient system recognized instantly, and had preyed across 10 millennia of silence that it would never have to recognize again. The alert came at 4 in the morning, local time, and it did not come quietly. Elena woke to the sound of her tablet buzzing violently against the metal shelf beside her cot, an emergency tone she had never heard it make before, sharp and insistent in a way that cut straight through exhaustion and sleep alike. By the time she had pulled on her boots and stumbled out into the corridor of the surface facility, the entire camp was already awake, lights blazing across the compound, soldiers moving with the fast, controlled urgency of people who had trained for exactly this moment and never truly believed it would come. She found Okafor in the command trailer, standing over a bank of monitors, with an expression carved from stone. General Okafor listening to a stream of reports coming in faster than any single person could properly process. "What's happening?" Elena asked, though some part of her already knew, had known since the moment her tablet screamed her awake. "The Warden's outer sensor network picked up a signal 3 hours ago," Okafor said, not looking away from the screens. "Something moving in system. Fast. On a heading that puts it inside Earth orbit within 11 days, if it maintains current speed." The Warden confirmed the signature an hour ago. "It's them." The words landed with a physical weight, and Elena felt the last fragile hope she had been quietly carrying these past weeks crack straight down the middle. "The Marrow." "The Marrow," Okafor confirmed. "Or something very much like them. The Warden's not certain of the exact composition of the fleet yet, but it says the signal pattern matches what its old sensor logs recorded from encounters 10,000 years ago, closely enough that it isn't willing to bet against it." Elena's mind raced through everything the past weeks had built, the weapons brought slowly back online, the joint command structure still finding its footing, the training programs barely past their first month, and felt the full, crushing scale of how little time 11 days actually was. "How many ships?" she asked. "The Warden's still refining the count," Okafor said. "Current estimate is somewhere between 30 and 50 vessels, though it's quick to point out that Marrow ships aren't built the way ours are. Some of what's approaching may not be warships in any sense we'd recognize. Could be seed vessels, carriers, things designed to spread and corrupt rather than fight directly. We won't know for certain until they're close enough for better resolution." Down in the central chamber an hour later, the Warden's light burned brighter than Elena had ever seen it, a steady, urgent glow that seemed to fill the entire vast room with barely contained tension. "I am sorry," it said, before anyone had a chance to speak. "I had hoped, across these past weeks, that we would be given more time than this. I was wrong, and I do not know how to properly express how much I regret that error." "No time for regret," Okafor said, her voice hard and clipped. Every trace of the tired philosopher from the desert nights burned away by the urgency of the moment. "We need a plan, and we need it now. 11 days. What can we actually do with 11 days?" The Warden's light pulsed, steady and quick, the visual equivalent, Elena had come to understand, of rapid and focused calculation. "My primary batteries are at full operational capacity. 4 of 6 restored, the 5th partially functional. My shields, which your engineers have only begun to properly understand, can be brought to 60% effectiveness within the time remaining, assuming the repair teams maintain their current pace. It will not be enough, alone, to face a fleet of this size directly. But it may be enough, combined with your own forces, to make the cost of attacking this world higher than the Marrow are accustomed to paying for a target they believe undefended." "Undefended," Chidi repeated quietly. "You think they don't know what they're flying into?" "I believe it is likely," the Warden said. "The Marrow do not typically expect resistance from cradle worlds. Their strategy relies on stealth and internal corruption, long before direct confrontation, and the speed of this approach suggests they detected my activation signal and are moving to investigate and neutralize the threat before it can properly organize. If that assessment is correct, we retain one advantage they may not expect. We know they are coming. They may not yet fully understand what they are flying into." Okafor absorbed this, already turning toward the door, her mind visibly racing through logistics, deployments, timelines. "Then we use every hour we have left. Full mobilization, every nation with orbital capability, every satellite defense system currently in service, brought under joint command by end of day. I want every available warship, human and otherwise, in position within the week." She looked back at Elena. "And I want you and the Warden working out exactly how human forces integrate with its systems, because if we're doing this, we're doing it together, not as separate fights happening in the same sky." The next 11 days blurred together into something Elena would later struggle to properly remember as distinct events, a relentless, exhausting rush of preparation that swallowed every waking hour. Nations that had spent the previous weeks cautiously cooperating now moved with a speed and unity that stunned even the most hardened diplomats among them. Old rivalries set aside not through agreement, so much as the simple, overwhelming clarity of a threat too large for any single power to face alone. Orbital defense platforms that had sat half-forgotten in budget disputes for years were suddenly fully funded and crewed within 72 hours. Fighter and interceptor squadrons from a dozen air forces began drilling together for the first time in history, learning to coordinate through translators and shared tactical software, cobbled together in frantic, sleepless nights by engineers who had never expected their careers to lead them here. At the heart of it all, the Warden worked tirelessly, its ancient systems slowly waking to full capacity, its vast intelligence coordinating a defense effort that spanned continents and, for the first time in 10,000 years, felt genuinely capable of drawing on the full strength of the world it had been built to protect. Elena spent those 11 days almost entirely in the central chamber, functioning as the increasingly vital bridge between the Warden's careful, deliberate way of thinking and the frantic human urgency surrounding it on every side. She slept in short, broken stretches on the same low platform where she had first heard the Warden speak, waking each time to the same steady, patient blue light, a strange comfort in the midst of everything. "You should rest properly," the Warden told her, on the 9th night, as she rubbed at eyes gritty with exhaustion. "I do not think your people would be well served by a chief liaison who collapses from fatigue before the battle even begins." "I'll rest when this is over," Elena said, managing a tired half-smile. "One way or another." "That is precisely the sort of answer I would expect from someone your people call brave," the Warden said, "and precisely the sort of answer I have learned, across a very long existence, to worry about most." On the morning of the 10th day, the first visual confirmation came through from an orbital telescope stationed at the edge of the asteroid belt, a grainy, distant image that nonetheless sent a chill through everyone who saw it. The Marrow fleet was not shaped like anything human engineering had ever produced. Vessels that seemed to grow rather than being built, dark and organic in outline, clustered together in shifting formations that defied easy military classification. "They're not flying in formation," one of the tactical analysts said, staring at the feed with visible unease. "Or at least, not any formation I recognize." "They do not require conventional formation," the Warden said, its voice carrying a grim edge Elena had not heard from it before. "They coordinate through means closer to a single organism reacting to stimulus than a fleet following orders. This will make them unpredictable by your standards. It will also, I believe, make them vulnerable in ways a conventional fleet would not be, if we can force them into a situation that disrupts their coordination." Okafor, standing at the center of a command room now buzzing with representatives from a dozen different militaries, studied the feed with narrowed eyes. "Warden, give it to us straight. What are our actual odds here?" The light pulsed, slow and thoughtful, weighing the question with the same careful honesty it had shown from its very first words in that buried chamber weeks ago. "Honestly," it said, "I do not know. I have seen fleets larger than this one broken by smaller defenses, when those defenses fought with unity and clear purpose. I have also seen far stronger alliances fall to forces smaller than what approaches us now, when fear and division did their work before the enemy ever arrived. The variable that matters most in this battle is not the size of the fleet bearing down on you. It is whether your people, all of your people, choose to stand together when the moment finally comes." Okafor turned to look out across the room, at faces from every corner of the world, soldiers and engineers and scientists who had spent 11 exhausting days learning to trust each other in ways that would have seemed impossible only weeks before. "Then that," she said quietly, "is exactly what we're going to give it." On the morning of the 11th day, with the Marrow fleet now visible to the naked eye as a faint, moving cluster of light against the pre-dawn sky, every screen across the command network lit simultaneously with a single, final message from the Warden, broadcast to every Allied vessel and station, now arrayed in defense of the world it had sworn, 10,000 years ago, to protect. "They are here," it said. "Hold formation, trust one another, and let them learn, at long last, exactly what it means to attack a world that refuses to stand alone." Far above the desert, where the fragile morning light was only just beginning to touch the tallest dunes, the first flare of distant weapons fire lit the edge of the sky, and the long war that had ended the Concord 10,000 years before finally, terribly, arrived at the doorstep of the one world it had never managed to find. In the command chamber deep beneath the desert, Elena stood beside Okafor, and watched the battle unfold across a wall of screens, fed by 100 different orbital cameras, each frame a small, terrible window into a fight larger than anything humanity had ever waged. The Marrow fleet broke apart as it entered range, individual vessels peeling away from the shifting mass in patterns that seemed random at first, and then, horribly, revealed themselves as coordinated. Dozens of ships converging on the same handful of human defense platforms all at once, testing for weakness, with a patience that felt almost worse than open aggression. First contact, Orbital Platform 7, a voice crackled over the comm. They're not shooting. Repeat, they are not shooting. They're just approaching. They are attempting to establish a connection, the warden said, its voice carrying through every speaker in the chamber at once, urgent but controlled. Do not allow any physical contact between their vessels and yours. If they attach to a hull, they will attempt corruption of onboard systems within minutes. Fire on any vessel that closes within docking range. The order went out across the network in seconds, and Elena watched, heart hammering, as human warships and orbital platforms opened fire on the approaching shapes, streaks of light crossing the black in silence that felt somehow more unsettling than any sound could have been. 3 of the Marrow vessels crumpled under the barrage almost immediately, breaking apart into drifting debris. A 4th absorbed the hits and kept coming, its dark hull rippling strangely where the shots had struck, as though the wounds were already closing themselves. They're regenerating, someone said, disbelief plain in their voice. How are they regenerating? Their hulls are not built the way yours are, the warden said. Concentrate fire on single points rather than spreading damage. It will overwhelm their regenerative capacity faster than distributed strikes. The battle stretched on through the morning, a grinding, desperate exchange that tested every hour of the past 11 days' frantic preparation. Human interceptor squadrons, flying in coordinated patterns practiced for the first time only days earlier, wove between the Marrow's strange, organic-looking vessels, drawing them into crossfires where concentrated batteries could finally punch through their regenerating hulls. Twice, Marrow ships slipped past the outer defense line entirely, driving hard toward the planet's surface, before the warden's own restored batteries, still operating below full strength, tore them apart with bursts of energy that lit the upper atmosphere gold for half a second at a time. Warden, Okafor said, watching a cluster of 6 Marrow vessels regroup and begin a fresh approach toward the largest human command platform. We're losing ground on the eastern flank. 7th Fleet reports 30% losses and falling back. I see it, the warden said. Redirecting reserve batteries to support their position. Dr. Voss, I require your assistance. The targeting handoff between my systems and the 7th Fleet's command network requires manual confirmation, and my processing is currently fully committed to 3 other engagements simultaneously. Elena did not hesitate. She dropped into the console beside the crystal column, fingers moving across controls that had felt, only weeks earlier, utterly alien to her, now familiar enough that her hands knew the shapes without conscious thought. Confirmed. Redirecting now. Across the eastern flank, a battery long thought too damaged to fire again flared to sudden, brilliant life, and 2 of the 6 approaching Marrow vessels vanished in a burst of white light that briefly outshone the rising sun. The turning point came just past midday, when the largest cluster of Marrow ships, nearly a third of the entire remaining fleet, abandoned their scattered probing tactics and drove as one directly toward the largest concentration of human forces. A desperate, brutal charge that seemed intended to break the defense through sheer overwhelming mass, rather than clever strategy. They've realized this isn't an easy target, the warden said, and for the first time since the battle began, something that might have been grim satisfaction colored its ancient voice. They are attempting to force a decisive engagement before their losses grow too costly to sustain. This is the moment, General. If we hold here, I believe the rest of their fleet will falter. Okafor did not hesitate. All units, converge on my mark. Warden, coordinate everything you've got. We hold this line if it's the last thing we do. What followed was the fiercest fighting of the entire battle, human ships and the warden's restored batteries working in tight, desperate coordination against a wave of Marrow vessels that seemed, for several terrible minutes, genuinely unstoppable. Elena's hands moved across the console without pause, confirming targeting locks, redirecting power between straining systems, relaying urgent updates between the warden's vast, calm processing and the frightened, exhausted human commanders fighting for their lives in the black above. Ships were lost on both sides. Voices crackled over the comm with reports of damage, of crews abandoning failing vessels, of narrow, desperate escapes. And then, slowly, terribly, the tide began to turn. The concentrated fire the warden had directed with careful, patient precision finally overwhelmed the regenerative capacity of the lead Marrow vessels, and one by one, they broke apart under the sustained assault, their strange, dark hulls finally failing to knit themselves back together fast enough to survive. The charge that had seemed unstoppable only minutes earlier faltered, then broke entirely, the surviving Marrow ships scattering away from the human line, in a retreat that felt, after the desperate hours before it, almost unbearably sudden. "They're breaking off!" someone shouted across the command network, disbelief plain in every word. "Repeat, the enemy fleet is breaking off and retreating." A ragged, exhausted cheer rose across the chamber, soldiers and engineers embracing each other in the sudden, overwhelming release of tension that had built across 11 days and one impossible morning. Elena sat back from the console, hands shaking, and allowed herself, for the first time since the alert had woken her days earlier, to simply breathe. "Warden," Okafor said, her voice hoarse but steady, "confirm status. Are they actually retreating, or regrouping for another pass?" The light in the crystal column pulsed, slow and careful, running through calculations that took several long seconds to complete. "Retreating," it confirmed finally. "Their remaining vessels are withdrawing on a heading that will carry them back beyond the outer system within the day. I do not believe they anticipated a defense capable of inflicting losses this severe. I believe, for now, we have won." The chamber erupted again, louder this time, and even Okafor allowed herself a rare, tired smile as she turned to look at Elena across the console. "For now," Elena repeated quietly, some part of her unable to fully release the tension of the past 11 days, despite the celebration erupting around them. "You think they'll come back?" "I think," the warden said gently, "that we have won a battle today, and won it well, together, in a way that would have seemed impossible only weeks ago. But the Marrow do not give up so easily as this single defeat might suggest. They will regroup, and they will learn from what happened here, and when they return, they will not make the same mistakes twice." It paused, and its light warmed slightly, something almost like pride entering its ancient voice. "But today, you have shown them something they have not encountered in a very long time, a world that refuses to face them divided. I do not think they expected that. I do not think, whatever comes next, they will ever be able to forget it." Outside, above the desert, the sky slowly cleared of the drifting debris and fading light of battle, and for the first time in 11 exhausting days, the sun rose fully over the Gobi Desert, on a morning that, against every fear that had haunted them since the alert first sounded, humanity had somehow managed to survive. In the weeks that followed the battle, the world changed in ways that no treaty or summit could have accomplished on its own. The footage was impossible to keep entirely secret, not after a battle fought in low orbit, visible to anyone with a decent telescope and a clear night sky. Within days, the truth of what had happened in the skies above Earth had spread across every corner of the planet, first as rumor, then as confirmed fact, delivered in a joint broadcast from Geneva that Elena watched from the mouth of the access shaft, standing beside Okafor and Chidi, in the cool evening air of the desert, that had, in the span of a few short months, become the most important place on the entire planet. The reaction was not uniform. Some cities erupted in celebration, crowds gathering in public squares to look up at a sky that had, until recently, seemed like nothing more than empty distance, now understood to hold both danger and, improbably, allies buried beneath their own feet all along. Other places responded with fear, with hurried questions about what else might be out there, with governments scrambling to reassure populations that the danger, for now, had passed. Elena understood both reactions perfectly well. She had lived through the same swing between wonder and terror, every single day, since she had first pressed her palm against the warden's hull. What surprised her most, in the months that followed, was not the fear, but the unity that emerged alongside it. The Joint Command Council established in Geneva, hastily assembled in the panic of that first long meeting, did not dissolve, once the immediate crisis passed, as she had half expected it might. Instead, it grew, slowly and imperfectly, into something that resembled the beginning of a genuine planetary institution. Nations that had spent decades unable to agree on climate policy or trade disputes, finding, in the shared memory of a battle fought together above their heads, a foundation sturdy enough to build further cooperation upon. She descended to the central chamber often during those months, sometimes for official business, coordinating the ongoing repair and study of the Warden's systems, and sometimes simply because the quiet, patient company of the ancient intelligence had become, without her quite realizing when it happened, one of the few places in her exhausting new life where she felt something close to peace. "You seem lighter today," the Warden observed, on an evening some 3 months after the battle, as Elena settled onto the familiar low platform beside its crystal column. "The Marrow haven't returned," she said. 3 months of silence. "Chidi's team thinks the losses we inflicted may have been significant enough to make them reconsider a second attempt, at least for a while. That would be a mercy," the Warden said, "though I would caution against mistaking a mercy for a certainty. I do not believe they have given up entirely. I believe, more likely, that they have retreated to reassess, and that when they choose to return, it will not be with the same overconfidence that cost them so dearly here." Elena nodded slowly, having expected as much. "So what do we do with the time we have?" "You grow," the Warden said simply. "You have spent these past months learning to work my weapons, my shields, my defenses. That is necessary, but it is not, I think, the most important lesson this experience has to offer your people. The Concord did not survive as long as it did, because of the strength of any single weapon. It survived because its member worlds learned, over centuries, to share knowledge freely, to trust one another across vast differences, to build together something greater than what any one world could manage alone. I would see your people learn that lesson faster than centuries allow, if such a thing is possible, because I do not believe the Marrow will grant you centuries to learn it in." Elena considered this, watching the crystal's steady pulse. "Is that why you've been sharing so much of your archive with every nation equally? Not just weapons data, but the history, the culture, everything the Concord recorded?" "Yes," the Warden said. "I could have kept certain knowledge close, offered piece by piece, as leverage to secure my own priorities. I chose instead to share freely, because I believe a world united by shared understanding will prove a stronger ally, in the end, than a world managed through careful rationing of what I alone control. I have seen what division costs, Dr. Voss. I have paid that cost with the lives of everyone I once called crew. I have no wish to see your world pay it as well." Over the following year, the changes accelerated in ways that Elena found genuinely dizzying to watch unfold. The Joint Command Council, now formally chartered as the United Earth Defense Authority, began coordinating not only military preparation, but a broader push toward space development that no single nation could have justified funding on its own. Orbital shipyards, built with combined resources and staffed by engineers from every continent, began the slow, careful work of reverse engineering fragments of the Warden's technology into human-scaled applications, propulsion systems that promised to make the solar system feel considerably smaller than it once had, shielding technology that offered protection against threats far beyond anything humanity had previously needed to guard against. Chidi's linguistic team, now grown into a proper academic institute with branches in a dozen countries, continued working through the vast archive the Warden had shared, uncovering piece by piece the deeper history of the Concord, of the many peoples it had once united, of the ancient human ancestors who had served among its ranks and left behind, in half-forgotten myths and legends across every culture on Earth, faint echoes of a connection to the stars that no one had ever properly understood until now. Elena herself found her role shifting steadily over that year, from scientist to something closer to diplomat, then something closer still to a kind of bridge between two very different ways of understanding the universe. She traveled constantly in those months, carrying the Warden's careful, patient wisdom to councils and universities and public forums across the world, watching, again and again, the same transformation she had witnessed in herself unfold in the people she spoke with, fear giving way, slowly, to wonder, and wonder giving way, in time, to a fragile but genuine sense of shared purpose. It was Okafor, unsurprisingly, who articulated the change most clearly, standing before the newly formed Defense Authority on the first anniversary of the battle, addressing a room that looked considerably different from the panicked, divided assembly that had gathered in Geneva a year before. "A year ago," Okafor said, "we stood in a room very much like this one, arguing over who should hold the keys to a weapon we barely understood, while an old machine buried beneath the desert quietly reminded us that division had already destroyed one great alliance among the stars. I will not pretend the year since has been easy. We have argued, we have disagreed, we have made mistakes that cost us dearly in time we could not afford to lose. But we are still here, together, in a way I do not think any of us would have believed possible, before that morning we first saw a talking column of light, and heard it tell us it had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this moment. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know when the marrow will return, or in what strength, or whether we will be ready when they do. But I know this: whatever comes, we will face it as one world, and not as 100 divided nations arguing over who deserves to lead. That, more than any weapon this ship has given us, may prove to be the most important thing we found buried beneath that desert." Elena, sitting near the back of the room as she so often did these days, found herself thinking, as Okafor's words settled over the gathered representatives, of that very first moment in the buried chamber, her palm pressed against ancient metal, a voice rising slowly out of 10,000 years of silence to say simply, "I have been waiting." She thought of the names Chidi's team had found in the archive, ordinary people from thousands of years ago who had once been carried away from this same world to serve among the stars, their sacrifice remembered only as half-forgotten myth, until a ship they had helped build returned home at last to tell their story properly. She thought, too, of everything still ahead, the uncertain months and years stretching out before them, the enemy that had retreated but not vanished, the long, difficult work of building something genuinely lasting out of the fragile unity this crisis had forced into being. It would not be easy. She understood that clearly now, in a way she had not fully grasped in those first frightened weeks beneath the desert, but it felt, for the first time, in longer than she could properly remember, like something worth the effort it would demand. That evening, she descended one last time to the central chamber, before catching a flight back to Geneva for the following morning's session, and found the warden's light glowing steady and calm, patient as it had always been, waiting, as it always seemed to be, for whatever came next. 1 year, she said, settling onto the familiar platform. Feels like a lot longer somehow. It does, to me as well, the warden said, though I confess my sense of time has grown strange across 10,000 years of waiting for exactly this. I find myself, now that the waiting has finally ended, uncertain how to properly measure the days that follow. I have not needed to think in those terms, in longer than your written history stretches back. Elena smiled, tired, but genuinely content, in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon after everything the past year had demanded of her. Any advice, for whatever comes next? The warden's light pulsed, warm and thoughtful, and when it answered, its vast, ancient voice carried something that sounded, unmistakably now, like hope. Only this, it said, whatever fear or division tries to pull your people apart in the years ahead, remember what you built together in the year behind you. Remember that a single hand, offered without fear, opened a door that had been sealed for 10,000 years, and that the door that opened was not simply mine, but one leading back to a history you had forgotten you carried within you all along. You are not merely the people who survived a battle against an ancient enemy. You are the children of a promise, made long ago, kept faithfully across an unimaginable span of time, and now, at last, fulfilled. I do not know what challenges still lie ahead of you, but I have waited 10,000 years to see this world stand ready to face them, and I find, watching you now, that I believe, more fully than I have allowed myself to believe in longer than I can properly measure, that you will. Above them, unseen in the vast dark beyond Earth's atmosphere, the stars turned slowly in their ancient courses, indifferent as they had always been to the small, fragile, determined world spinning quietly beneath them. But somewhere among those distant points of light, a war that had ended one great alliance 10,000 years before was not yet finished, and somewhere among them too, perhaps, other cradle worlds still waited, unknowing, for their own chance to wake and stand, at last, together. For Earth, at least, that chance had already come, and had already, against every fear that once seemed insurmountable, been met. Elena stayed a while longer that evening than she had planned, reluctant to leave the quiet warmth of the chamber for the noise and pressure of the flight to Geneva waiting for her at dawn. She found herself thinking about the very first fragment of gray metal she had pulled from the desert floor all those months ago, warm to the touch despite the cold ground it had come from, and how little she had understood then about what that small, strange piece of the world would eventually mean. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Something that isn't about weapons or councils or defense strategy." "Always," the warden said, its light softening slightly, the particular glow she had come to recognize as its version of settling in to listen properly. "The people who served aboard you, all those thousands of years ago, do you remember them? Really remember them, not just their names in an archive somewhere?" The light dimmed for a long moment, thoughtful and slow, and when the warden answered, its voice carried something Elena had rarely heard from it before, a kind of tenderness that felt almost fragile against the vastness of everything else it had shown her. "I remember them," it said. "Every one. Their voices, their small habits, the particular way each of them walked my corridors when they believed no one was watching. I have carried those memories through 10,000 years of silence, Dr. Voss, because they were, in the truest sense, the only family I have ever known. I did not build myself, I did not choose my own purpose, but I chose, across every year we served together, to love them as fully as anything built from crystal and metal is capable of loving anyone at all. When the war took them from me, one by one, I grieved in whatever way something like myself is able to grieve. I have grieved every day since, quietly, in the long dark beneath this desert, waiting for a moment I was never entirely certain would come." Elena felt her throat tighten, unexpectedly moved by the admission. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up something so painful." "You did not," the warden said gently. "You asked a question worth asking, and I find I am glad, after so long a silence, to finally have someone to answer it. Grief carried alone for 10,000 years grows heavy, in ways I do not think your language has proper words for. Sharing even a small measure of it, with someone who listens as carefully as you do, has been its own kind of gift these past months. I do not think I have properly thanked you for that." "You don't need to thank me," Elena said softly. "I think I needed this too, more than I realized when I first touched that door." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the chamber's soft light pulsing steadily around them, until Elena finally rose to gather her things for the long journey ahead. "I'll be back in a week," she said. "Chidi thinks he's found something in the deeper archive layers, records from before the war even started. He wants both of us there when he opens them properly." "I will be here," the warden said, and there was warmth in the simple statement that had not been there in its very first words, all those months ago, when it had spoken only of waiting and duty and promises kept across an unimaginable span of time. "I find, now that the waiting has ended, that I am rather looking forward to whatever comes next." Elena smiled, and made her way back up through the long corridor toward the surface, past the alcoves of ancient armor that no longer felt quite so frightening as they once had, past walls that pulsed gently with the soft blue light of a ship, slowly, steadily, coming fully back to life, after 10,000 years of patient sleep. She emerged into the cool night air of the desert, the same sky that had once seemed so empty and distant, now thick with the quiet knowledge of everything that moved beyond it, danger and wonder both, waiting somewhere in that vast dark for whatever came next. Above her, the stars burned on, ancient and indifferent, keeping whatever secrets still remained. But for the first time since a hand had first pressed against cold, sealed metal deep beneath the sand, Earth no longer faced that vast dark alone. And whatever the years ahead might bring, the world had already proven, in the crucible of one impossible year, that it was ready, at last, to meet them together. The desert wind moved softly across the excavation site as she walked toward the waiting transport, carrying with it the faint hum of machinery below, the low murmur of engineers still working through the night, and somewhere beneath it all, patient and steady as it had been for 10,000 years, and would, she hoped, remain for however many years were still to come, the quiet, waiting heartbeat of a promise finally kept.